But we're continuing to explore also, besides this series in Genesis, and now as we're looking at the call of Abraham, we're also continuing to explore this topic that we've been talking about in recent weeks in church, about the call of God. And so as we look at the call of God in Abraham's life, we are seeing that it's the start of our call as the people of God as well. But before we go into the sermon, I just want to do as a refresher as well, what do we mean when we talk about the call of God? So some of the confusion, I think, sometimes is because, we use the same term when we talk about the call. We sometimes refer to it as call, the verb, the action of calling, to call someone. And then sometimes we talk about it as the noun, the thing that you call someone to. So to just simplify, we don't have time to go into all of it, but just to briefly simplify, when we speak of the call of God or God's calling, let's define both the verb and the noun. So the verb in the Bible, when God calls, that action of calling, both in the New Testament in the Greek word kaleo, and then in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word kara, both convey this sense of to summon someone, or, as Singaporeans, we might say, saman. So, you can think of it this way. When you think of this word as a Singaporean, right, you think of a policeman, saman, a judge, saman, it's a figure of authority. So God's calling, there's an authoritative sense to it, that God summons us as God, as Lord of all, as our Lord. So when we talk about the call of God, God calling us, He's summoning us. Now, what is the noun then? What is the thing that He's summoning us to? Biblically, whenever we talk about the call of God, it's always to a specific purpose. So God always summons someone to a specific purpose. In the Old Testament, then the prophets like Jeremiah talk about their calling. I was called from the womb to be a prophet. In the New Testament, Paul the apostle talks about, Paul, an apostle that called by God to be an apostle, a specific purpose. So we can ask then, what is the specific purpose that God calls us to or summons us to? So we don't have time to go into all the details, but just briefly enough for our understanding, as we'll see in the story of Abraham as well, we can speak about the specific purpose that God calls us to. Firstly, our universal purpose that God calls us to for all believers, all Christians, I'll put it like this, is to live in relationship with God and then to live out that relationship with God. So relationship with God, living in relationship with Him, and living out that relationship. That's the universal, specific purpose of all believers. It's specific to believers, to Christians, because it's not specific to the rest of the world. God calls us to be His people, to live in relationship with Him and to live out that relationship with Him. And then within that specific purpose to all Christians, then God calls each Christian to unique, specific roles, tasks, missions, according to the unique gifts and desires that He has placed in each of us. So some called as prophets, some are called as pastors, some are called as missionaries, some may be called within your secular roles, secular work. 1 Corinthians says that to remain in the calling that you were called in. And some, perhaps as moms or dads, and of course, as we are seeing all these different roles and tasks, we can see as well that, some have multiple roles, multiple specific purposes that we are called to as Christian, as a worker outside, as serving in the church, as a mom, as a dad, multiple hats. And so then these are how then uniquely each Christian, each and every one of us is meant to live out that greater universal purpose of being in relationship with God and living out that relationship with God. So I hope this brings some clarity that we are all called. So there's a universal call, there's a unique call under that universal call to all of us Christians. Okay, so then last week then, the call of God, the call to Abraham. Last week we saw in the call to Abraham how Abraham was able to trust God and answer the call. We saw how we can trust God and answer the call wherever that He may lead us. Even if we don't know the whole journey, but enough for us to answer and to take the next step. And so then this week, as we continue in the call of Abraham, how he followed then the call, the next steps and the next steps, then we will see for ourselves what are the next steps in following the call of God. What does following the call of God look like? What do those steps look like? And we'll see then it's not one single moment and that's it. We answer the call and that's it. Pick up the phone and that's it. Rather, I submit to you today that following God's summon looks like a life of progressive surrender. So it becomes less of a life of myself going my own way, living aimlessly according to how I want, and more in line with the direction that God is summoning me towards. So it's a life of progressively surrendering to that call. And so as we look at our passage today, we're going to identify 3 examples in Abram's life of this progressive surrender that would help us to see then, whether we are taking the next step and the next step and the next step in following the call of God, and whether we are making progress in walking in the purpose that God is calling us to. So 3 areas of progressive surrender. Firstly, in chapter 13, verse 1 to 4, we see a surrender in Abram's returning to God in worship. So remember where we last left the story at the end of chapter 12, Abram had just screwed up big time. He was wandering away from God's purpose and where God had called him to, and he had wandered and gone into Egypt. And it could have ended for him so much, much worse if it wasn't for God intervening and rescuing him. And so now we're back on track again, following the call of God. And now in chapter 13, feeling stung by his failure, by his shame, Abram could have easily gone elsewhere to have another go. Or he could have even gone back to his father's house in Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia, back to that pagan lifestyle. But fortunately, Abram is progressing in surrender and trust. Abram recognizes that it is God who has been watching over him this whole time. And so in response, Abram does what is right. He repents and returns to God. And so we see in verse 3, it tells us that Abram returned to Bethel. Bethel means the house of God, actually, the name. The place where his tent had been at the beginning, going back to the start all again. The place where he had made an altar at the first, and the place where he had first called upon the name of the Lord. He returned to God in worship. And the essential truth about this, brothers and sisters, is that every time when we return to God, it always brings a renewal. That's the grace of God. In the face of failure and shame, instead of rejection, Abram finds his restoration and renewal with God. And God could have easily said, that, you're no longer fit to call upon my name. But that's the grace of God. He knows that we are human. He knows that we are weak and broken. He knows that we need him and we need his grace. So this is the God who calls us not by our greatness, but by his grace. And as a result, all we need to do is respond. And as a result, Abram responds. He returns to God in worship, and he is refreshed and renewed in spirit. And because he's then spiritually prepared, There is a difference from before, from how Abram responded in the chapters before. There's now a progress in how Abram handles the situations that are about to come. So returning to God in worship always brings renewal. Why is it this way? This is because God, firstly and most foremostly, He wants you for you. God desires, firstly, a personal relationship with each of us. This is our priority. This is the reason why, we've seen in Genesis that God created man in His own image. This is the first specific purpose that all of us have been summoned to. We've been called into a relationship with God. So this is why wherever that we've been each and every week, whatever that we do every week on the Lord's Day, God summons us to this specific purpose of don't neglect the assembling together. We come again each and every week. We heed God summoning us to this specific purpose of worshiping Him. Wherever that we've been in the world, each week we come, we repent, we return to God in worship to find a renewal in our spirit, in our strength, and in our purpose. All of this first must flow from relationship. So this is the first step that Abram takes in following the call of God. So the first area of progressive surrender for us, brothers and sisters, to look for, to see whether we are following the call of God, is progressing in our relationship with God. So next, in chapter 13, verse 5 to 12, we see a surrender in Abram's determined to commit himself to God's righteousness. So Abram has now separated from Egypt. He's separated from this carnal world of selfish pride and of sinful desires. And now he's resolved himself to walk humbly in God's righteousness. And so when there is strife with Lot, Abram acts humbly and he acts with righteousness. He cares for Lot. He defers to him. As the elder, Abram could have demanded his way. But then in love and care, in righteousness, Abram cares for Lot's well-being as best as he can, even as they amicably separate. And of course, this separation, one thing I want you guys to see is that this separation was necessary and bound to happen actually. Because even though Abram acted righteously and he loved and cared for Lot, treated him like his own family, Abram and Lot represented two completely opposite sides of faith. One side, Abram was resolved to live according to God's righteousness. But we'll see that Lot was content to live according to the flesh. Brothers and sisters, the essential truth about this, that resolving to commit to God's righteousness always brings rejection. Rejection and separation are just a natural and necessary consequence of following a God who calls us to the specific purpose of being set apart to Him, to be set apart from the world, to be set apart to His specific purpose, to be set apart as a special people that belong exclusively to Him. And so the rift between Abram and Lot shows us this fundamental difference between ourselves as the people who have been called by God for His specific purpose, and for the people who just follow the call of the world. And the difference is that we don't share the same mission. So the classic text for this, of course, is 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. That verse about don't be unequally yoked with the world. And it says, what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? It's a separate path. It's completely separate missions. And of course, the answer is that there can be no more partnership than there could be between two rivals, like this picture here of Pepsi and Coke. So, this was from the recent Super Bowl advertisement this year. Pepsi and Coke, they are big rivals, and so they had this ad that went viral of the Coca-Cola bear. Pepsi had this Coca-Cola bear. The laws are different in the states, so with advertising, they can actually play out their rivalry so much. So the Coca-Cola bear taking a blindfold test, and then in the end, he picks Pepsi, and then he's devastated. Like, when he opens his eyes, oh no, what am I to do? Why do they do that? Because they are completely, directly opposite, bitter rivals with, you may say, Pepsi and Coca-Cola. What's the difference? Both of them are cola. But they are rivals. They have a completely separate mission. And of course, in the case of Christ and the world, it's not just drinking a different kind of cola. It's more like drinking a soft drink, and the other side is drinking a poison. But, you get the picture. And why is it this way? It's because God calls us to walk by faith and not by sight. He calls us to walk by trusting in Him and trusting in His leading wherever He may be calling or summoning us to. So Abram was called by God to live by whatever that God had said. And so he restfully is able to trust in what God has summoned him to. But on the other hand, we see that Lot lives by what he sees. And so he restlessly lusts after what his flesh has succumbed to in the world. And so in verse 13:10, it would seem that according to the eyes of the world, according to our human sight, according to the flesh, it would actually seem that Lot has actually chosen the better portion. Because during that time, the place that Lot chose, the valley of Jordan, the city of Sodom, that whole land was very fertile. The verse tells us that it was very well watered, and it even makes this statement that it was like the garden of the Lord. So according to human sight, it would seem that Lot had found paradise on earth. And what's more, during that time, the place that he went to live in, the city of Sodom, was the major city of that time. It was the largest city, possibly the thriving major city, possibly the largest in Canaan. But yet, as rich and as fertile that this area was in the eyes of men, naturally rich, yet verse 13 reveals to us what matters. And it says that in the eyes of God, actually, that morally and spiritually, it was just as rich and fertile, but it was rich and fertile in wickedness and sin against God. And so here's the thing for Abram, when he separates from Lot. Verse 14 onwards tell us that after Lot had separated from him, that the Lord spoke and revealed his specific purpose to Abram in a much deeper way than before. So brothers and sisters, don't be deceived by what our eyes can see, by human sight, by our flesh. Any so-called paradise on earth that is outside of God's promise is just a false substitute. It's house brand Coca-Cola, which turns out to be poisonous. And in later chapters, actually, we'll see that the city of Sodom would then be completely destroyed in the end, and disaster will befall Lot and his family there. So take heed, brothers and sisters. Don't live by sight like Lot did, but trust in God for it, the real thing. Take heed, if not, you might end up buying a knockoff. You might buy a Dave soap, a Dolce and Banana. You might go to 7 Evelyn. Or you might get a Surprise! And instead of following Jesus, you might end up following a doctor or a Red Cross worker, if you get the reference. So, brothers and sisters, resolve yourself to walk in God's righteousness. And as you resolve to walk in God's righteousness, don't be alarmed. Rejection from the world is natural. Separation is necessary as well. Because we are meant to be in this world, but we are not of this world. But brothers and sisters, in the midst of rejection and separation, keep your resolve. And as you progress in God's righteousness, then the assurance is that you will progress as well in discerning more clearly God's calling on your life in a much deeper way. Finally, we come to chapter 14, and we see a third kind of surrender in Abram's relinquishing to God's control, surrendering more to God's control. And you might call this section then, war. Who? Ha. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Because if you read this part, we come to the war now. Okay, let's just recap a little bit of the story. There's a lot of names and places, but let me just break this down simply and then we'll get to the lesson here. So let's review the story. First, in chapter 14, verse 1 to 3, it tells us that this war broke out between these two factions. Okay, so just remember, never mind about all the names, there's just two factions. One is the 4 kings of Babylon and Persia, these foreign invaders, versus these 5 kings of Canaan. They've got the home ground. Okay, the aggressors were the 4 kings of Babylon and Persia. They are led by this guy, Chedorlaomer, the king of Persia. And then the defenders are these 5 kings of Canaan, the natives of the land. Okay, verse 4 then tells us the reason for the war. The reason for the war was that for 12 years, these kings in Canaan were serving this foreign rule of Persia. And then in the 13th year, they finally decide that, look, we're going to rebel. We don't want to be under foreign rule. And so then in verse 5 to 7, then Chedorlaomer, the king of Persia, is upset. And so he gathers a whole coalition of kings. And then he goes and he attacks the cities of Canaan. And he conquers one city after another, one name after another, one great people. It's all part of his systematic strategy that he's going to isolate all the surrounding cities, picking them off one by one. So, he's going to isolate Sodom and Gomorrah, the key city, by picking off all these surrounding border cities one by one. So he defeats them all. And then finally, when he has Sodom and Gomorrah surrounded, then in verse 8 to 10, we reach the major battles. The kings face off on both sides. But even though there are 5 kings of Canaan versus these 4 kings, they are forced now to fight. They are surrounded and they are forced to fight in the valley of Siddim. And so we are told in the verses that this valley was full of these bitumen pits, these tar pits, where people can get caught in, they can fall and get caught in. And it is here then that the Bible tells us that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into these pits, and so they were defeated. And then finally in verse 11 to 12, then their cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were plundered, and as part of the plundering, Lot is captured and taken away as prisoner. So, before we go further, let's understand, what does this story of the war represent? So when I read the story of the kings going to war, my first instinct, my first thought is that, which side do I root for? Which are the good guys? That's a natural thing, right, when we see two sides battling. And the answer is that there isn't a good side in this war. So what is the war meant to depict to us? It's depicting the situation in the world. And so the first thing it's a picture of is that There is no longer any neutral ground in this world. Because to be in the world is to be in a spiritual war zone with violent forces on each and every side, trying to take ground and trying to take people captive. This means that there's no side to root for in this world. The only side to be on is none of them in the world, but it's only the side with those with Abram. It's those who align themselves with God. And so the picture that this gives us is that outside of God, everywhere in this world, there is danger on every side. The enemy comes from all sides. It's always trying to surround us, to isolate us, to defeat us, to rob us, and finally to enslave us and destroy us. And what's more, there's no longer any level playing field as well. We might think, brothers and sisters, in this world that, okay, never mind, I'm holding a strong suit. I have 5 kings versus 4 kings. How can I lose? We might think in this world that we are in control and we've got the home field advantage as well. But brothers and sisters, we know from this story, this world is not our home, and there is no home advantage here in this world. And so if you choose then, like in the story, to make your base in the valley on this lower plane of the world, all around you'll find is just sinking sand and pits that you could fall into and be defeated. Jesus said in Luke 14 verse 31 to 33, he says, which king goes, he talks about which king before going out to engage another king in battle. Very, very apt, this story. Which king before he goes out to engage another king in war will not deliberate first whether is he able to defeat his foe or not? And if not, then Jesus says that he would then surrender and ask for terms of peace. And then Jesus ends this by saying, all who want to be his disciple must surrender their all to him. What Jesus means is that in this world now, we face a battle that we can't win on our own. We were never able to win the victory ourselves over the king of this age. And to go our own way is then to guarantee defeat and destruction. And so, brothers and sisters, the safest side to be on is to relinquish all our control over to the King of Kings. But now we come to the essential truth about this, is that every time we relinquish control to God's control, it always brings risk. So this is the most paradoxical thing, right? We've been saying that there's nothing safe, there's no safe side in this world. The safest place is to relinquish control to God, to be on his side. So now what kind of logic is this, right? You're thinking, Pastor, what logic? You said that it's safe, but now you're saying that there's risk. And it's true. Logically, when we think about it, the safest place to be would be the place that has the least risk, right? Okay, so let's look at this. So logically, Abram has believed in God, he's trusted in the promises. God has been his provider, God has been his protector. And now he's starting to settle down in the land and he's tasting the fruits of the good life in the promised land. So logically, Abram should be now safe and secure and say that, I've got to where I am now, I'm safe, I'm secure. Lot made his own choice, let him go and fend for himself, I'll send him thoughts and prayers. But is it safe? Of course not. The kings can simply attack again and conquer where Abraham has been. This is logic, our logic. But then logically, the word that I've made up myself, to show, instead of taking our own logic, we take the mind of Christ and we follow his ways. Logically, safety and security, brothers and sisters, is not found in this world. It's not found in staying behind in this world, or staying put, or staying stagnant. It's found in following wherever God leads. Brothers and sisters, the real risk that we face is to stay behind. But of course, the risk that we face when we follow God is that he wants us to relinquish all our own control over to him. And that means giving up whatever that we think is best for ourselves, for what God knows is best. So Jesus said in Mark 8:35, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will gain it. So paradoxically, logically, in God's economy, following the call of God means even when there is risk, even if he calls us to deny ourselves, to take up our cross daily, and to give our lives for his sake, it's actually still more safe and more secure than anything else this world can promise us. And so then, knowing this, laying aside all his self-interest, from verse 13, then we see that when Abram hears of the plight of Lot, by faith, Abram rides out to rescue Lot. And why is it this way? It's because God calls us, God blesses us to be a blessing. He blesses us not to keep it to ourselves, but to be a blessing. And why is it so? Because this is the heart of God. The God who calls us to be just like him. And so there are 24 verses in this whole chapter, but the pivotal verse in the whole story of this war is not about the kings. It's right in the middle, in verse 12. It's not about all the many different hard to pronounce names of the kings, but it's about this one name here, the one name that mattered to God. And that was Lot. Because this is the God who scripture says in 2 Timothy 2 verse 19, the Lord knows those who are his. And God doesn't care about all the possessions that are taken, all the provisions that were taken. What mattered most to him was, verse 12, they also took Lot. This is the heart of the God who Luke 15:4 tells us he goes after that one sheep, even that one sheep that is lost. And God could have said, let that no good, selfish Lot, let him get what he deserves. But instead, God's word tells us they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother. This is the God who, while we were still helpless, Romans 5:6 tells us that Christ died for the ungodly, and he desires that none should perish. So Abram rides out with great risk for that one sheep that is lost. Because this is the God who said that I lay down my life for the sheep. This is the God who says I came to set the captives free. So Abram rides out, even at the risk of sacrifice. Brothers and sisters, this is the God that calls us to do the same. This is the God who blesses us, not to keep it to ourselves, but to take the risk and to be a blessing. For the sake of the lost, then, we go into all the world, even at the risk of no guaranteed results from those that we reach out to. Right after this, later on in Genesis 19, we see that Lot goes right back to live in Sodom again. But nevertheless, Abram goes, and he does it as serving unto the Lord. And that's all that God calls us to. He calls us to be a blessing and to bless even those who curse us for his name. And for the sake of the lost, we go, even at the risk of no reward or reputation in this world. And so at the end of the story, from verse 21, the king of Sodom comes and he offers Abram all his worldly riches. But we see Abram progressively surrendering to God, progressively following the summon of God. Abram has grown in his surrender to God. And so when faced with the temptations of this world, Abram refuses, because Abram has determined that God alone is the one who blesses him, and that God alone is the one whom all the glory and honor belongs, not to any king, not to Abram himself, but to God alone. And this is the principle behind this last picture in chapter 14, Melchizedek. This is the principle behind Abram's tithe to Melchizedek. It's that he's surrendering to God. It's a picture of surrendering to God. And so this last story that I want to bring you all in the chapter, in verse 18 to 20, we suddenly come to this figure named Melchizedek, who pops out of nowhere. And it's just these three verses that I said of him. Melchizedek comes, and then he blesses Abram, and then in response, Abram gives him a tithe of all that he had. What is this picture about? Brothers and sisters, it has nothing at all to do with Melchizedek, the man, but it has everything to do with Abram surrendering to God. So this story, Melchizedek was just a normal man. All we are told by the divine author here in his writing, all we are told about Melchizedek is meant to point us to him being a representation of Christ. So we are told these few things. One is that Melchizedek is called the King of Salem. And Salem this means literally the King of Peace. And Melchizedek's own name is King of Righteousness. And then we are told he is called a priest of God Most High. The divine author is trying to signal to us. It's like Christ, our mediator. And then finally it says that Melchizedek brought bread and wine to feed those who were with Abram. And this is a picture of the work that Christ has done for us as well. In other words, simply, Melchizedek is a picture of Christ, our Lord. And so therefore, Abram's example is a model to us of surrendering to the Lord, saying that, Lord, whatever I have is actually all yours, and all that I am, Lord, is at your service and at your disposal. So, brothers and sisters, which king will you surrender to? In the story of Abram, although we are still in the early part of the story, in the early part of following that call, and it's still a long ways to go before we will see the promise fulfilled to Abram. And brothers and sisters, in your life and mine as well, there may also be a long, long ways to go before you see that promise fulfilled in your life, before you reach all that God is calling you to. And you can't see it yet. But Abram's story gives us an example of faith and what it looks like for us to progressively surrender to the summon of God, to continue to surrender ourselves to follow that call wherever that God is leading us to. Because the story shows us that the God who calls, He's the King of Kings. He calls us, this King of Kings, to surrender our all in relationship with God, in walking in righteousness with Him, and in our sacrifice and in our service. And it may seem like a lot right now, and it's why God progressively reveals to us. He doesn't show us the big picture all at once. And maybe all of this seems a bit overwhelming. Maybe the call to surrender our all seems overwhelming. But brothers and sisters, wherever that you are on this journey, take heart from the story of Abram. Perhaps if you're new to this, then just take this example of faith and just start with that next step. Start with that 10th of your life, wherever it is. Perhaps say, God, I set aside a 10th of my life. I set aside a 10th of my time. I set aside a 10th of my loyalties for perhaps, my time in this relationship with you, in my devotions daily. Or I set aside these habits, just a 10th. I take a step towards walking in righteousness with you, Lord. Or I take a step, a 10th of stepping in obedience, relinquishing my control and following what you said. You've blessed me to be a blessing. I take a 10th of that blessing and I go out and I serve in a 10th. Or I go out and I just maybe speak a few words to someone that I know outside. Maybe I go and reach out to someone a bit, just a 10th, just to someone that I know. Right? What was that thing that we looked at last year? One in 10 years? One for Jesus, 10 years. Things like that. Maybe 10 people. Who is that one person? Or I say I take a 10th of my time to go and pray for him. Take these steps to follow God's call, because the God who calls us is calling us to surrender our lives. Let us go to God in prayer.